Welcome back to Schola Christi. Why don't we stand and we'll begin, and we'll start with our opening hymn. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. You might be surprised. You might be asking, "Where is Father David?" I'm not just Father David shaven, in case you were wondering. That was what was going on. So, we decided to sort of change the Schola Christi up a little bit, to change the format slightly. If you've been following along, you're used to proceeding with Father David through Romano Guardini's book. And as a community, in conjunction with Father David, we sort of got together and decided that maybe, in addition to all the other things that we do, maybe having Schola Christi carried out by one priest was asking too much. And so we decided to diversify it a little bit. You'll be seeing other priests. I'm doing the first one apart from Father David. And we're sort of going to share the burden. We don't have a terribly detailed roadmap moving forward, so I think Father Josh is slated to do the next one, but then for 2019 we'll have to figure out a schedule. But basically, I think what's going to happen is the Schola Christi meetings will be individual presentations, so it won't be a continued theme, unless that may change in the future. We could go back to that in one way or another. But the plan right now is to have individual one-offs. And tonight will be mine, and then in months to come, you'll see others as well. Tonight I thought to look at a peculiar text. Great, my remote is working. It's thrilling. So we're going to look at this peculiar text. It's about Noah and his sons. Perhaps you've come across this text. It doesn't come up too often. It's not in the lectionary, as far as I could tell. I tried to see if it comes up in the Sunday readings at all. I don't even think it comes up in the daily readings. But it's tucked away in Genesis. We're going to read it in a moment, so don't worry. And in fact, why don't we just do that right now? The text is in your handout, but I have the full text on the screen in case you just want to follow there, so you can choose whichever you'd like. And I'll read it for us. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So it's worth noting that the flood has just happened. And so they've disembarked from the ark. The waters have receded. The earth is dry again. The 40 days of rain are over. So the sons are all getting out. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from them the whole earth was populated. Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine, became drunk, and lay naked inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness, and he told his two brothers outside. Shem and Japheth, however, took a robe, and holding it on their shoulders, they walked backward and covered their father's nakedness. Since their faces were turned the other way, they did not see their father's nakedness. And I might say that that's what this image is presenting. When Noah woke up from his wine and learned that his youngest son had done this to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be his slave. May God expand Japheth, and may he dwell among the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." Noah lived 350 years after the flood. The whole lifetime of Noah was 950 years. Then he died. And this is a strange text, and we're going to try to understand it, but I thought I would mention to you why it came to my attention. That painting, by the way, is a fresco from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And that's where I came across the image, and that's where I came across the idea to take a closer look at this text. I'm going to Rome in March with the CMU Newman Club, with the Carnegie Mellon Newman Club. And I think this will be maybe the third time I'm visiting the Sistine Chapel. And the first two times I went, I was simultaneously overwhelmed and underwhelmed. Overwhelmed because you step into the Sistine Chapel and it's this amazing, riot of color. This is what you see after you sort of walk in a little bit. You walk through the entrance, walk a ways across the floor of the chapel, turn around, and this is what you see. You see the Last Judgment on the wall behind the altar, and then of course on the ceiling we have Michelangelo's renderings of what's called the primitive history, as it's recorded in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And I use the word primitive, but I don't mean that in the pejorative sense that we often take it today. You know, when we call a cell phone primitive, we mean one of those old-fashioned flip phones they used to use in the Wild West or something. You know, but it's there's one right there. Very good, thank you. In case you were wondering, in case you couldn't remember because it was so long ago, But primitive should be taken in the sense of primary or first. And in fact, you know, Cardinal Newman in his litany to St. Philip refers to St. Philip as the man of primitive times. And what he means is the early church where there was this amazing apostolic zeal and where the Holy Spirit was active in all kinds of amazing ways. And Cardinal Newman is in a sense saying that Philip kind of represents those in his person, in his zeal, in his evangelical virtue, represents the virtue of those, of the zeal of that primitive era of the church. So the primitive history is on the ceiling, but of course, when you walk in like that, when you walk into a room like this, you don't know where first to look, you know. And so I found myself thinking, well, I'll just try to find the things that I'm used to seeing, or the things that I know are here. Like where's that amazing image of the creation of Adam? So I look up on the ceiling because I know that's where it ought to be. And of course that doesn't help because this is what you see when you look up. I mean, you're some distance away from the images. And so it's just this confusion, then you're sort of looking around and here's the creation of Adam here. But then, you know, you're looking like this, and my neck was getting a little stiff, and then before you know it, you're being shooed out because there's so many people there. You're not given a lot of time to take a look. So I was determined to make the most of it. In fact, here are some of the images that we are used to seeing. Here's the creation of Adam, but of course you're getting a much better look at it sitting here in Pittsburgh than you would in the Sistine Chapel itself. And here is the creation of the sun and the moon. I finally figured out what's going on here.
It's the moon.
Yeah, right. The other moon. Yeah. So God is actually creating the vegetable matter of the earth. So that's what's going on here. But of course, the vegetable matter is not prominently displayed. God the Father's hind end and the soles of his feet are much more prominent. This is Michelangelo, right? So I guess it's got to be good. But if you're Michelangelo, I guess you can get away with that sort of thing, you know, depicting God that way. But in any case, this is what you're seeing when you look up from the floor of the chapel. So in going back, I was determined to know what I was looking at. And a few months ago, I was sort of looking, just kind of clicking around the internet, looking for information. And of course, now there's this richness of information available. In fact, let's see, okay. And so here we see a kind of a map of the ceiling. And so I was kind of looking at this and studying it, and all the things were familiar, but then I began to notice, you can see how prominently Noah is featured. 3 of these panels of the primitive history are devoted to him. And Noah is here, the one that the image that we were looking at a moment ago. Let's see, where is it? I'm going backwards. This is an image. This is the painting of a part of the text, a specific verse of what we just read, and it's depicting, again, verse 23 of chapter 9. Shem and Japheth, however, took a robe, and holding it on their shoulders, they walked backward and covered their father's nakedness. Since their faces were turned the other way, they did not see their father's nakedness. This is what's depicted in that image. And in fact, here it is in its proper context. You see in the ceiling, you can see some of the images are just take up the entire space of the painted surface. Others have these other kind of, they're called ignudi, which is, I think, is just the Italian word for nude. These nude men are depicted around the image, and that's the case with the one that we were looking at. So this is what you actually see. And here again, this title is interesting. What this guide calls it, Noah is drunk and disgraced. But we're going to see that maybe is the wrong way to think about it, or that's the wrong aspect of the image to emphasize. It's all the more interesting. It's all the more interesting to think that Michelangelo devoted all that attention to that particular image and that sequence of Noah's life when you look at it in light of what is not there. When you look at it in light of what Michelangelo did not depict. He didn't depict, for example, Cain and Abel. This is from another artist. It's not in the Sistine Chapel. Or say like the Tower of Babel. Those are all scenes of that primitive history that are much more familiar to us. And we might think, well, why not depict something like that? Why not depict one of those better known events rather than this kind of strange story about Noah and his sons? But again, I hope to show you today why it is significant and why Michelangelo maybe is displaying a certain keen insight into the importance of that scene and what's being depicted there. That's kind of what I'd like to explore with you here. As I came across that image, it just so happened that I recalled something that Father Stephen had told me. A few months ago, Father Stephen said that Scott Hahn, who is familiar to us, he's the biblical theology professor at Steubenville, that Scott Hahn wrote an article, an extensive, very, very detailed, very carefully researched scholarly article on this very scene. And so as I was contemplating or wondering perhaps why Michelangelo gave it so much attention, I recalled the fact that this article existed. I went on the internet and there it was. So much of what I'm going to say today is taken from this article from Scott Hahn. He sort of goes through this and explores this little passage in an admirable way, and I think in a way that really kind of breaks it open and underscores its significance. I'm just going to move through that. Okay, good. In this article, Dr. Hahn says, or he remarks, and this is one of the difficulties that we're going to face as we try to make sense of what's said in the passage. Dr. Hahn mentions that, well, he says of this passage, the compressed, elusive narrative of Genesis 9:20-27 has been an exegetical puzzle since antiquity. So if you've ever read this story, or if you're wondering what it might mean, you're not alone. This has been a hard text to interpret from the very beginning. Whether you're talking about the church fathers, the medieval theologians, or modern scholars, people have had a hard time understanding what it says, and he points to why. It's very compressed, and part of our work is going to be to expand it a little bit, to unpack it, and it's a difficult job. But Scott Hahn helps us a lot. I'm reminded, too, of words that kind of ring in my ears whenever I read the book of Genesis. John Paul II, in the course of the Theology of the Body, talks about that the theology of the body contained in Genesis is concise and sparing of words. And if you've ever read the Theology of the Body, you know it's enormous. So what is concise and sparing of words can be explained with a great many words, or sometimes it requires a great many words. And so, again, that's what we're going to have to do. But in the course of doing that, one has to be careful. And I think one of the reasons why the Bible, in general, is so sparing of words is because there's, perhaps a fear on the part of the sacred author, kind of a hesitancy to say too much. If too rich a description is given in the manner of, like, say, a modern novelist, there's always the danger that the author will kind of falsify the revelation, or just sort of, or perhaps just simply get in the way of its simple and straightforward reception. And so the biblical authors, I think, show this kind of admirable concision and reticence in the face of what they're describing. But of course, in our attempt to understand it, we can kind of provisionally enrich what we find there. There's a history of interpretation. before I took that slide back. Before we consider it, I'd like to just say a quick note. This text presents to us some difficult issues that we're going to have to face. We're all adults, so I'm not worried about it. But there's an important kind of sexual content to the text, and furthermore, the text discusses, and our discussion will cover kind of the sad reality of sexual practice, sexual abusiveness or sexual assault. And this sort of put me off to the topic. When I initially thought of presenting it, I thought, well, maybe this isn't a great idea. Perhaps I should find something a little more cheerful, a little less grim. But as I thought about it further, just think about our time and all that we hear in the news. I mean, the church scandals are being discussed, but it's not confined to the church. We hear about sexual assault scandals that affect everything from the Supreme Court and the hearings there to Hollywood. Even it occurred to me earlier today that Father Drew wrote a wonderful movie script that we're going to read on December 1st. You should all come to that. But what's at issue there is again a kind of a sexual predator, and Cardinal Newman's a real life case where Cardinal Newman had to confront a sexual predator, and Cardinal Newman, it was an occasion of great suffering for Cardinal Newman, but he dealt with that courageously. So I think these stories and that aspect of life is just continually thrusting itself before us, continually putting itself before our eyes. And so I think as we contemplate it and as we think of how to address it or how to think about it, of course we ought to look at the Word of God and try to consult what it's try to kind of behold the sensitivity with which the Word of God deals with these themes. Not that they'll help us settle any of these cases, or not that it will help us adjudicate any of these matters in our mind or in the world, but it'll form the basis by which we approach and think about these things, and I think ultimately inspire greater confidence in the Word of God, an assurance that it's taking our world and the human condition with total seriousness. So in the history of interpretation, as we contemplate, what is going on here? And I suppose one of the things that's worth looking at is the anger of Noah. What Ham has done prompts him to curse Ham, but also Ham's progeny, Canaan. And so what is it that is going on here? What's happening? There are a few possibilities. The first possibility that Scott Hahn considers in the course of his essay is voyeurism. That Ham has viewed the naked, is just the straightforward interpretation of the story. Ham has viewed the nakedness of Noah, and this has offended Noah, and been it constitutes some serious transgression. The other, brace yourself, is castration. That somehow Ham has, surgically removed the genitalia of Noah. That this is what that means. And the third, is male incest. That Ham has slept, or we might say raped his father. His father's drunk, and he goes in, and the beholding of the nakedness is an indication of male rape. But Scott Hahn goes on to consider these, and he says about voyeurism, what it has going for it as a theory is that it refuses to see anything in the text that is not explicit. So it's taking the text seriously, literally. He goes in and sees the nakedness. That's just a simple, straightforward description of voyeurism. The weakness is that it fails to explain the gravity of Ham's offense or the curse of Canaan. The voyeurism as such, or simply beholding another person's nakedness, is never really described as a terrible crime in the Bible, at least not in the way it's presented here. So, and Scott Hahn notes further, it presumes a taboo against seeing the nakedness of the father, of which there is no evidence. It isn't the case that the Bible is terribly concerned about that. Castration, it's a strange explanation. It's a strange scenario, but it has a root in the tradition. Traditionally, rabbis regarded that as an explanation of what was going on. So, and there are counterparts in ancient Near Eastern mythology, but again, the weakness is similar to the voyeurism. There is no evidence for it in this particular text. The text doesn't refer to castration, doesn't make any explicit reference to it, nor is that issue really explored at all within the rest of the Bible. So this would, if this is true, it would be a unique and strange instance, and there just isn't a lot of basis for believing it. Paternal incest, or the male rape of the father, is, Scott Hahn mentions, it's the most popular theory today. That scholars in general tend to believe this one, or that's the explanation. Its strength is that it introduces the theme of sexual transgression, which seems to be a part of the story. Uncovers himself. Noah goes into the tent and uncovers himself. This has a kind of an erotic overtone. A sexual theme is introduced there that the theme of incest takes seriously. There are other instances in the Bible where drunkenness and sexuality are united. They occur together. Lot, the brother of Abraham, commits incest with his daughters after becoming drunk. The Song of Songs, the vineyard, is the place of lovemaking. And then David gets Uriah the Hittite drunk in the hopes that he'll go home and sleep with his wife. So there are these instances in the Old Testament where drunkenness and sexual activity are united. Perhaps you've already seen a difficulty with this theory. All of these instances are heterosexual in nature. And we're going to see that that's a problem as we go forward. The story of the flood, of course, which is the immediate setup for the story of the drunkenness of Noah, there's a sexual transgression. The sexual transgression is the kind of a prelude to the incident of the flood. The sons of God and the daughters of human beings mate, and then that elicits this time of chaos and confusion, which the Lord sort of loses his patience with, and initiates the deluge, which wipes out the earth in the 40 days. Yeah, Father.
Father, could you elaborate on what scholars think that sin really is?
The sons of men and the I couldn't give you anything definite. And to be honest with you, perhaps we can come back to that during the question and answer period, just so I feel like I'm already a bit behind on my slides. But anyway, so the sexual theme is maybe in the right direction, but Scott Hahn doesn't agree with paternal incest. The weakness of the paternal incest, the male incest, the idea that Ham has slept with his father, the paternity of Ham is at issue. You can see Ham is repeatedly referred to as the father of Canaan. So it seems to be the case that fertility is in play here, which wouldn't be the case with homosexuality. And Canaan is mentioned, the son of Ham is mentioned again and again. And in each of the praises of the other brothers, a curse of Canaan is repeated. And Canaan is so it seems to be the case that this story purports to be, perhaps not directly, but it ought to be regarded as an explanation for the origin of Canaan and the origin for this kind of cursed status. So it's difficult to kind of harmonize that or unite that with the sin of Ham, if that sin is homosexual in nature. So Scott Hahn's proposal, this is what Scott Hahn concludes: this is a case of maternal incest, where the son has slept with the mother, because there again there's the possibility of offspring. And this is what is referred to by the father's nakedness. So when Ham uncovers the father, or when Ham beholds the father's nakedness, what this refers to specifically is the spouse of Noah, Noah's wife. And the strength of this is that formula is found elsewhere in the Bible. And Scott Hahn points out an interesting case in the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus, which is it's a book of laws, and any book of laws is going to have a lot of prohibitions, and it prohibits the seeing of the father's nakedness. And I'll just read Leviticus 18, 7 through 8. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father. So these are prohibitions against incest. And that's the way these texts have been interpreted from the very beginning. And Scott Hahn lists these other texts from Leviticus where the same formula is used to describe the same reality. In all of those texts, the woman's nakedness is described as the nakedness of her husband. So in other words, the wife is in some, so beholding the nakedness of the father is seeing the mother and engaging in sexual activity there. So one of the things that we ought to consider as we kind of consider the significance of this, it's a strange thing that's being discussed. It's a strange reality. But if we think of families, and if we think of wives and mothers in terms of the nuclear family, it's going to be hard to imagine what's going on, or it's going to be hard to relate, I think, to what Leviticus is trying to prohibit. But you have to remember that in the ancient world, there was the practice of polygamy. So an older man might have younger wives who would be of the same age as his sons. So, and I think bearing that in mind sort of renders the whole situation a little more comprehensible. And in fact, as we'll see, there are a number of instances elsewhere in the Old Testament where this kind of incest occurs, where the son is not necessarily taking his mother as an object of sexual interest, but it's one of these other wives, or even like, say, concubines of the father. This happens in the case of King David and Absalom. If we have a little bit of time, we can look at that text. But I'm sorry, Michael.
There's also Reuben.
That's right. That's right. There's an instance of one of the sons of Jacob. That's right. He's cursed on that basis at one point. So, and so what is going on? Like, what is the significance of this incest? And Scott Hahn considers this. He quotes a scholar who says, "A son who has sexual relations with his mother or stepmother commits a rebellious sin against his father, since the possession of a man's wife is seen also as an effort to supplant the man himself." And this, again, you see this in the story of David and Absalom. When Absalom rebels against his father David, one of the things that happens is a collaborator with Absalom, suggests that he go and steal David's wives. And so Absalom actually this is all described in 2 Samuel, I guess, where Absalom does this in public. He's displaying, like, look, I have taken my father's concubines, and they are mine now. So the sexual interest of the son in his father's wives is a function of this usurpation. It's a power play. It's an attempt to overwhelm and humiliate the father. So that's, but we'll look at that more closely in a moment. These are some of the other instances where this sort of thing occurs. If you've maybe in high school or something like that, you read the story of Oedipus Rex. And Scott Hahn refers to that. He says this is an obvious Greek parallel for the usurpation of the father's position through, among other things, the possession of the mother. So Oedipus has, without knowing it, he has killed his father and taken his father's wife as his own wife. And this is a sign that Oedipus, and this is in the play, this is seen as a monstrous act of rebellion. That the son has usurped the father, struck him down, humiliated him, and taken his place. I've already referred to Absalom. This is another, we don't have to go to Greek tragedy. We don't have to go beyond the Bible to find examples where this happens. Michael brought up the case of Reuben. David himself, Absalom does to him what he did to King Saul. David takes King Saul's concubines as a part of his taking of the throne. And then Adonijah, elsewhere in that literature, attempts to do the same thing with King David. Ezekiel rebukes his contemporaries for doing this. He says, "In you are those who uncover the nakedness of your fathers." So this is a reference to the same thing. It's a strange reality, something I think that strikes us as odd, but you see how frequently it comes up within the Bible. And again, bearing in mind this kind of expansive, diffusive family structure, I think helps us understand what's being presented a little bit better. Okay, so this is a remark that Scott Hahn makes in the course of the article. These are all notable examples of a son attempting to unseat his father through relations with a paternal consort. I think this phrase is really useful, a consort. Rather than thinking of these women necessarily as wives and mothers of the sons that have become sexually interested in them, these are sort of women belonging to the father in various ways. Maybe the wives of sons, yes, but also concubines or other kind of parafamilial relations. This is I'm going to look at this image with you a little bit more closely in a moment, but this is from an illuminated manuscript that comes out of Germany. This is the same as the one depicted by Michelangelo. You see Noah, the sons. This is Ham. Here's the offender, and he's trying to get Japheth to look on the nakedness of Noah, but Japheth is refusing. You can see Ham is being kind of earnest here. He's tugging on his sleeve, but Japheth won't do it. So what are the other brothers doing? This, after all, is what Michelangelo depicts. We know now what Ham has been up to. What are the other brothers doing? Shem and Japheth, however, took a robe, and holding it on their shoulders, they walked backward and covered their father's nakedness. Since their faces were turned the other way, they did not see their father's nakedness. So what's going on? Scott Hahn has a very kind of elegant, I think, explanation, a very simple one, or perhaps it's not so simple, but we'll figure it out. This is his account. This is his final description of the entire story. Ham enters and sees his father's nakedness, that is, engages in relations with his father's wife. He exits and informs his brothers of his grasp at familial power, perhaps producing an article of clothing as proof of his claim. So Ham has gone in, usurped the father by stealing the wife. He's saying, "I've humiliated Dad, I've conquered him." And he goes out to tell the brothers, and this kind of bragging is an attempt to include them in this usurpation, to include them in the rebellion. But they refuse the invitation. And that's what's indicated by them going in and covering the nakedness of the father. The brothers, in turn, act with excessive filial deference and piety in returning the garment to their humiliated father, avoiding not only the figurative seeing of the father's nakedness, but the literal as well. In the aftermath of the event, sorry, that's a typo. In the aftermath of the event, Noah curses the product of Ham's illicit union, namely Canaan, and blesses Shem and Japheth for their piety. So this, I think, is the most important part. This kind of union, or this conjunction of the figurative and the literal meaning. So them not wanting to see the father's nakedness is depicted kind of literally in the story. They refuse to look on the Father and see him naked. But in so doing, the author is kind of in a kind of a careful way, maybe in a euphemistic way, avoiding this figurative meaning that we've been exploring so far. So that this is, I think, where we're confronting, or what we see here is the compression of the text. The author is being, like the author is not elaborating for us exactly what's happening, but we can sort of piece it together based on these other bits of evidence. But do people follow that, this literal and figurative use? Okay. So here again, we see, I think here, in this image, you see kind of graphically, or I think what the artist has represented in this really, very explicit way, this idea of Japheth's refusal. You see him covering his eyes, and he's resisting the tug there on his garment. He's refusing to have anything to do with what Ham has done. Ham has tried to usurp and humiliate the father, displace him in the same way that Absalom was trying to displace David. But Japheth won't accept the invitation. In order to understand, I think, the full significance of this, and this idea, kind of the usurping quality of sexual, because I think what the text is presenting to us is the way in which sexuality becomes an aspect of life where power and the thrill of domination enters in. It isn't just simply, it isn't just simply a pursuit of pleasure or like physical enjoyment. I think this is why, people have a hard time understanding the church's teachings on sexuality, because they sort of think, well, Christians or the church simply has a hard time with people having fun, or has a hard time with pleasure. We don't trust pleasure, and so therefore we want to prohibit sexual activity or certain kinds of sexual activity, or we have all kinds of prohibitions on activities that people don't perceive any problem in. But in the book, we see here again, as I alluded to earlier, the Word of God deals with sexuality, as with so much, in a subtle way. And it comes up in the book of Genesis. And this again, we're back to Michelangelo now. This is Michelangelo's depiction of the fall. And you get this wonderful perception of before and after. This is Adam and Eve just before, on the threshold, I guess you could say, of the fall. And that threshold is kind of demarcated by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They're taking the fruit from the serpent. They've been seduced, as it were. They've accepted an invitation, and now this is the consequence. They're being excluded by the angel. The angel's forcing them out of paradise, and history as we know it has begun. But in the course of the description, God describes in the book of Genesis the condition that Adam and Eve are going to face, and us with them. So it begins with, and part of that, this is all given in Genesis chapter 3. To the woman, God said, I will intensify your toil in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So there's this theme of domination, this theme of submission. And this is going to be something that confronts Eve. In his theology of the body, John Paul II, in a way that's really it's just an incredible discussion of human sexuality in the theology of the body. But he talks about the problem of using another person, subordinating another person to selfish purposes. And that's exactly what God is saying Eve is going to experience. Adam's urge will be to dominate her and to make her an object of selfish use. That's going to be the tendency of the male approach to women. And who could doubt that that's a big part of human life. And it's interesting that Michael Waldstein, who's a translator of John Paul II, he uses the word dominate. So in the NIV, and in the I see there in the Dewey Reams, which is a traditional one of the first Catholic English translation. The Douay Rheims uses the word dominion, but in Michael Voldstein's translation of this text, as John Paul II quotes it, he says he will dominate you. So there's that idea of power and authority, and this idea of domination and subordination God is saying that this is going to be a part of the human experience of sexuality. God is sort of predicting that sexuality will be an occasion of abusiveness. And so all of this is kind of foreseen. There's an interesting phrase that I really admire. St. Augustine uses this phrase in the City of God. He talks about the libido dominandi. And literally, it would be, you could translate that as the lust to dominate. And I think this is exactly this idea of the lust to dominate, the thrill of domination, the thrill of subordinating another person to your own selfishness is exactly what the Lord is indicating in this 3rd chapter of Genesis. And the quote from City of God here St. Augustine says, "This vice of restless ambition was the sole motive to that social and parricidal war." He's commenting on a war that was a part of Roman history, ancient Roman history. "The lust of sovereignty disturbs and consumes the human race with frightful ills." So it's interesting that St. Augustine is talking about a political situation. He's talking about a war. But this lust of sovereignty, or this lust to dominate, applies in that case as well. And of course, when St. Augustine says the lust of sovereignty or the lust of domination disturbs and consumes the human race with frightful ills, we might say that observation is relevant in every existential sphere, in every aspect of human life, whether you're talking about the relations of men and women, families, communities, or even the way nations relate, the way that this kind of maybe it was Henry Kissinger who said something like, "Power is the greatest aphrodisiac," or something like that. I mean, I think that this is similar to what St. Augustine is talking about. But so when these brothers refuse to view the father's nakedness, when the brothers refuse to participate in Ham's usurpation, we can think of them as resisting that seduction. They're resisting that temptation. They've seen Ham, they've seen him humiliate the father, they've received Ham's invitation to participate in this, and they refuse to give into that. They refuse to participate. And I think that's really the genius of Michelangelo. I have to suspect, I don't know that this is recorded, I don't know that he communicated why he included this on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but I think that's my guess, that he sees in this event recorded in the book of Genesis this great gesture of brothers refusing to participate, of refusing to go down this terrible path of the lust to dominate, to usurp the father. And rather far from it, this covering up of the father's nakedness is a gesture of restoring their father to his former dignity, of protecting his honor, and helping him in a weak moment, in a vulnerable moment. You follow what I mean? Yeah. So I think this resonates powerfully with what Christ tells us. I mean, I think that one of the reasons why, wait, what is going on? This is skipping around. Let's see. Okay. Wait a minute. Okay, sorry. This my presentation skipped a slide. So, but anyway, we can make do with this. I think why this text is so significant, why this text of Noah and his sons is so significant, because it forms a kind of a bookend, I think, with the story of Cain and Abel, which is, we've already sort of looked at an image of that. But in light of all of this, I recalled a little detail from the story of Cain and Abel. It's the story famously of one brother killing another. Abel offers an offering of a sheep, and that sacrifice is accepted by God. Cain offers an offering of grain or whatever it was, it's some sort of vegetable matter, and it's not accepted. Cain is jealous of Abel. But then Cain says to Abel, let us go out into the field. Let us go out. I think that's an important detail, and I think that detail is all the more significant in light of this story from Noah. Because, I was doing a little Google image search, looking for images of Cain and Abel. And this is a painting by a guy named Francisco Goya. He's a Spanish painter, and his paintings are very dark and troubling. And we'll take a closer look at it in a moment. It's not a depiction of Cain and Abel, but it's simply titled Men Dueling with Cudgels. So it's not necessarily Cain and Abel, but it's the same idea. But in the story of Cain and Abel, in a lot of the images, you see Cain sort of ambushing Abel, sneaking up behind him, and he's standing over him with a big rock. He's going to smash him with a rock. It's depicted as a kind of an ambush. But here suggests something else, that Abel had to kind of accept an invitation. That Cain says, let's go up into the field, because that field symbolizes something very powerful. And I think that this painting sort of suggests to us exactly what it symbolizes. Because these two men are dueling with cudgels, but as you can see, they're mired up to their knees in what looks to me anyway like sand. They're sort of stuck in sand. And so these guys would have trouble sort of pulling away from each other, even if they wanted to. This conflict has escalated, and they're at odds with each other, and they would have trouble pulling away. But as you can see, that sand is sort of accumulating. They're becoming increasingly mired in this sand as the escalation intensifies, as the rivalry escalates. The sand kind of increasingly traps them in their conflict. But as the sand rises, it's also going to flatten out all of these features. You can see there are mountains back here, there's a valley. If you look closely, and this isn't a great image for us to see it, there's actually a town, maybe here and here. These guys are actually giants. They aren't just sort of normally sized persons. This is a depiction of giants battling it out. In fact, Spain and France were in a terrible conflict at the time this was painted. So this may very well depict two nations slugging it out. But I think that this invitation that Cain issues to Abel, Cain issues to Abel, he invites him up into the field, this flat surface. In fact, in some translations it says the plain. So it emphasizes this flatness. So, it may be that Abel could have avoided this, or maybe the text is suggesting to us that there was some degree or some way in which Abel collaborates with Cain, that he's antagonized in some way, that Cain picks a fight with him, and he accepts. He accepts to enter into the conflict that will eventually claim his life. You follow what I mean? So the fact that it's issued as a kind of an invitation, again, I think recalls the image or it recalls this text of brothers who do not accept the invitation, who refuse to be brought into this conflict. And so I think that this story kind of foreshadows a lot of what we hear from Christ. Christ says, so much of the Sermon on the Mount is about refusing to be seduced, whether it be sexually, whether it be by violence and conflict, refusing to give in to resentment, refusing to give in to all the ways in which we're drawn into pointless and sterile conflicts, and refuse to give in to this prideful impurity. So this is Christ. I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And then Christ says, do not give in to temptation. Refuse the invitation to impurity. Refuse the invitation to iniquity. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. And then Christ, we can think of the love of enemies in exactly that way. If someone strikes us, we forgive. If someone curses us, we bless. These are the ways in which we sort of imitate those brothers of Ham who refuse to give in to the conflict that again claims the life of Abel. And then St. Paul's exhortation to remain pure. Whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there's any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. I think these exhortations to cultivate a pure heart, a peaceful heart, are all kind of foreshadowed. The preaching and the ministry of Christ are all foreshadowed in that strange but, when understood properly, beautiful text of Genesis. And then again, of course, we have the Beatitudes. I mean, maybe there's no better kind of New Testament counterpart to what I'm trying to describe to you than the words of Christ as he begins the Sermon on the Mount. A lot of the quotes we looked at a moment ago were from the Sermon on the Mount, but he inaugurates the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes, and we hear him saying, "Blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure of heart, blessed are the peacemakers." All of the things that so we could think of Japheth and Shem again as foreshadowing these exhortations of Christ. We see them enacting what Christ wants us to embrace as well. I think that's all I have. Yeah, that's it. So are there any questions? Are there any questions or observations? Father Peter.
So you said that the Beatitudes there's no better counterpoint to that story than Genesis, but so not to be too contradictory, but my brother Joey, this is his insight about how the best photo-negative example in the New Testament to the story of Ham and Canaan is the crucifixion, because you see that how Ham, to usurp his father, looks on his nakedness and makes his mother fruitful, thus resulting in a curse. Jesus, in obedience to his father, through his own nakedness on the cross, makes his mother Mary fruitful when he says to her, "Behold your son," thus bringing all of us blessings from his crucifixion and the motherhood of Mary.
Okay. Yeah, good.
So photo-negative crucifixion.
That's great. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Is there any evidence from older church history that some other thinker had a similar idea that Scott Hahn had about this? That the way he interprets it, is he the first one to come up with the idea, or have others that thought maybe they interpreted it the same way? Maybe it's been lost over.
I'd imagine there has to be some precedent for it. When you engage in scholarship, it seems like in the 2,000 years of Christianity and the however many more 1,000 years of Judaism, that just about every idea under the sun has been brought out. So my guess is that there are those who have found that idea before. But Scott Hahn said, part of doing literature in a modern setting is that you do a review of all scholarly opinion. And in the course of his review of the scholarly opinion, he discovered that this was a minority, to say the least, view. And in fact, those other ones, especially it seems like he was quite explicit, in fact, in saying most prominent scholars today regard the paternal incest as the best explanation. But I think he's very convincing to me anyway that that's not the case.
But it is established that expression, the nakedness of the father, was a common expression amongst them.
It's repeated consistently throughout the scriptures, yeah. Claire.
When Noah speaks to him, he says, twice I think he says, "Cursed be Canaan." And I wondered, I was reading that text in the Bible this afternoon. Isn't from Canaan come Sodom and Gomorrah?
Right. Well,
And then also the Canaanites, the tribes that Israel then defeats.
that's right. So Canaan is the progenitor of this race that is a continual problem for the Israelites. The Canaanites were the original in the military conquest, and then there's a continual source of friction between them. And I think that this text is an explanation of where that conflict comes from. It's a common it occurs a couple times in the Bible where people certain nations or ethnicities that are a problem for Israel, their origin it occurs in at least one other instance where the origin of, I think it's the Moabites, they're described as being the result of an incestuous union. So it's sort of like, it's kind of like it's an explanation of that. It's an explanation of the origin, in some sense, explains why they're such a problematic people and why they're so corrupt, And but you can see Canaan. It is interesting, when the story begins, Ham is introduced immediately as the father of Canaan. So it's let's see. Oh wait. You see, so this is the beginning of the story. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. So he's almost immediately introduced as the father of Canaan. So it makes sense that the story would have something to do with the origin of Canaan as the son of Ham. So the heterosexuality of the incest is kind of demanded by that almost.
Is there any scriptural clue that would say that when they got on the ark that Ham had a wife or didn't have a wife when he trotted on?
It does say that they got onto the ark with their wives.
Okay. In general.
Yeah, and I think in the letter of St. Peter, he talks about there were 8 people. He refers specifically to the fact that there were 8 people on the ark. So that would be Noah and his wife, and then the 3 sons and their wives. So that would be. So I think the idea is that. I guess you could say adultery too. In addition to, there's all kinds of problems there.
Just good. You know what that figure is? That's what kind of
him back here?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Is that the wife? Maybe?
Oh, he's got a beard.
That's a beard. That's a guy for sure. Yeah, yeah. But maybe things were different. Maybe things were different back then. I don't know. But there's actually another little interesting. I noticed this as I was getting my. One of my favorite pictures from the Sistine Chapel is the Delphic Oracle. But I just noticed it's just my favorite picture from the Sistine Chapel, so I put it in as a placeholder in the beginning. But there's this figure back here of from the neck up, it looks like maybe a 10-year-old boy, but then you see like the musculature. It's like he's like a 10-year-old bodybuilder, So and then there's this, and then he's reading from this text, and there's this sort of like a pony with paws holding the book. So good luck explaining what that is. I don't know. So
I kind of assumed that the man in the background, he wasn't going to paint a whole panel of Noah cultivating the earth.
Oh.
So I kind of figured that the man in the back is Noah cultivating the vineyard.
Yeah.
That's a good thought.
No, I don't think so, Ron, because the man in the background has a small beard. And Noah in the
But maybe it's a time sequence. It's
It's
a time sequence.
That's
That's
a
good.
long time to make the first wine.
That's good.
You're not going to get instantly. Father Michael.
Yeah.
So, the curse of Canaan, what I'm getting from that and the other curses that appear when, like, the Moabites are doing their not so good things, does that mean that the curse of the father follows throughout the generations? Does it mean they can't?
Well, in that case, the text seems to be saying that this is that the people of the Canaanites is sort of begotten in this iniquitous way, and they just sort of carry on. it becomes like just a feature of their culture, I guess you could say. Which isn't. Maybe we can understand it, or it's something similar is said in our expression, "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." That it's, but this is a reference to the people as a whole.
Well, in the New Testament, doesn't Christ reference the fathers have eaten grapes and the son's teeth are on edge? Like that, the Old Testament history of the son paying for the sins of the father that he's now basically putting an end to.
Okay. Yeah, I recall that text. Is that from the New Testament? That might be an Old Testament.
It's a proverb, but it's quoted by Christ.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Was there a question? Oh.
One thing I think is really interesting, this is just a thought, but one of my favorite passages in literature, one of my favorite books is Paradise Lost. And I've always thought it was really beautiful insight and this story and just sort of the illumination that, for kind of a really sad length of time, the Old Testament is basically the history of sexual sin. I mean, it's just like from one to the next to the next. And I always thought it was such a really powerful and sad, devastating little passage of Milton's where, Adam and Eve are going along and they're like beautiful and innocent and pure and walking with God and working together in the garden. And Eve, eats this apple and gives it to Adam, and the first moment that he doesn't even have to say anything, because it says that Adam turns to his wife and she's blushing with lust. And he responds to that, and that's like the moment of their great fall. And then they awake from this like frenzy and are ashamed and like realize what they've done. But it's really tragic, like the very, very first moment of human fallenness is expressed in that way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think, it seems to me that, what you find in Genesis is the idea that, again, like this idea of the fall manifests itself at every level of human relating, whether it be like the individual couple, the man and the woman, but then also it affects the family, but it affects the social scene too. It's the same root cause. It's just that's sort of manifesting itself at all of these different levels. And that's why I love that use in St. Augustine, where he talks about like the lust to dominate, and it could describe so much kind of predatory sexual behavior, but St. Augustine is using it in political contexts, describing the expansion of the Roman Empire and how it just became like drunk with power, or eager to accumulate control over the surface of the earth. And it's
there's something there, Father. This is a very difficult topic. There's something there malignant in that lust for power, right? And so it's hard to find out how these things connect. But human relations are supposed to be intimate, not to be an exercise of dominance, right? That it seems like you're bringing out that, or that these words and images bring out the idea that a sexual act that is, let's say, deviant, right, produces a malignant type of lust for power that ends up in destruction.
right.
Destruction of the person who perpetrates it, but not just dominion over other people in terms of an authority structure, but actually a destructive malignancy. I don't want to take this into some really ugly negative, but you can see that I'm trying to find some way that this matches up to what we're seeing today, and it seems like there's some serious
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a kind of a delusion that comes over. I think a lot of these people who are involved in vice in these ways, they kind of, like Ren was referring to it in Milton. They wake up one day and say, like, what was I thinking? Like, what came over me? Like, there's a kind of I think people in the course of their lives, as they look back on their former selves, they think, Like, what on earth was I doing, or what was I thinking? There's a kind of a delusion, a deception that kind of comes over people who give into these seductions that they can only see after the fact.
But what Canaan did was premeditated, though.
Ham, you mean?
Ham.
Yeah.
What Ham did was premeditated. There was like a malice involved in that, not just a,
Sure.
oh my goodness, we got swept up into something and I woke up to what in the world, right? But there was
Sure.
something else there.
Well, there's one of the things, I sort of skipped over this slide. My controller's not working as flawlessly as it often does, but there's a great quote, again, from a little bit further on in the City of God, where is it? Yeah. So, away then with these deceitful masks, the deluding whitewashes, that things may be truthfully seen and scrutinized. You know, I think that it's a powerful idea that St. Augustine is saying that lust, obsession with power, obsession with control, it distorts our ability to see other persons and the world as it truly is. We're lured ahead by false values and goals that ultimately prove themselves to be worthless at best, if not, and in fact, in most cases, a liability. But he's saying but there's this sort of almost like a feeling of like exasperation, like St. Augustine's saying like enough of this, let's stop it, which leads you to believe it's harder to accomplish a freedom from this kind of delusion than maybe we might first think. And the life of discipleship and the work of being pure, the sacraments, grace, prayer, asceticism, these things are all the means by which to move through false values, false ambitions, vain hopes, and finally arriving at the truth. So Ham, who knows what he was seeking? And maybe at one point in his life he realized, like, what was I thinking? Like, what was I doing? It's interesting that alcohol is at issue there, and but metaphorically and literally, drunkenness is a cause of people. We talk again. I use the phrase drunk on power, or like kind of the dizzying effect of alcohol is a great. The dizzying effect of all intoxicating substances is a kind of a great metaphor for the distorted perceptions of those who give in to these temptations. But we have to resist it. As I say in homilies sometimes, spiritual blindness, which I think is what St. Augustine is talking about here, spiritual blindness is particularly difficult because we don't see it. Physical blindness is a kind of an ironic quality to physical blindness, in as much as the physically blind can see their own blindness. The physically blind know that they're blind. But so often we don't know that we're spiritually blind until it's too late, until we've seen what a mess we've made of things.
That's what Jeff was saying about this Garden of Eden when the Adam and Eve after they ate the fruit. I heard once said that one of the things that Satan really envied of humans was that God allowed them to procreate, as angels cannot do that. And because in that way that God gives humans a little bit of what God has a way to create. So because of that particular envy that he had, humans be able to do something that they cannot do. He wanted to, Satan really wanted to pervert that as much as possible, and that the act that makes him different. He really dare it as much as possible, and that was maybe part of the issue that we have with this.
It's interesting. The idea of the angels envying us.
I mean, Satan.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry. Right. Oh, the fallen angels. Right. The same.
He wanted to destroy it and ruin it as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Because,
Yeah.
maybe that was the real fall of the years.
Right. That's interesting.
Just to answer the question from earlier about the Nephilim, the sons of men, the daughters of men and the sons of God, producing these great heroes of old. One really old rabbinic interpretation of that was that the angels came and procreated with men, resulting in those creatures called the Nephilim. Other interpretations being that the sons of God were the sons of Adam, and the sons of men were the sons of Cain, being the two different lines. That's a little more accepted, I think.
Huh.
Exactly. That doesn't work. That doesn't actually. Angels procreating with man doesn't actually make sense because of how we understand angels. But give the early
But hey,
rabbis a break.
Are we splitting hairs there? No. Well, any more thoughts? Any more questions? Great. Yeah.
Just a little question. So you were talking about drunkenness, and we're talking about this passage. So if we're interpreting it in a particular way, how do we interpret Noah's drunkenness? And do we just take that at face value?
Yeah, I think taking it at face value is okay. I mean, he, like the uncovering himself and going into his tent naked is a suggestion that he went into his tent for the sake of sexual activity. But of course he was married, so that's okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And he was also the first, he made the first vineyard. And Michelangelo puts in the vineyard press. And then this is the bowl he was probably drinking out of. But of course, he invented wine, so he didn't really know what he was going to do. So I think he's got a pretty good excuse. He just didn't know. He just, he won't, say, wow, that was a weird experience. I think I'm going to think twice about drinking that purple stuff I made, or I don't know. I mean, but he learned the hard way on this one.
I wonder if there's a kind of, if this could maybe be seen as kind of deepening Ham's sin insofar as wine, I think, has a kind of, it's a communal symbol, right? Because wine is something that's enjoyed together, and it also provides this kind of openness and the kind of feeling that presents. And Ham is taking advantage of this thing that has been created, and instead of using it to further this community, he's using it to usurp.
Which is actually not. I was just thinking as you were talking. That's a great metaphor for sexuality itself. Like sexuality, it's clear from Genesis that sexuality is Adam's exclamation at Eve, at the sight of. I mean, he's elated at the sight of this woman with whom he can have a life, and sexuality is supposed to be a source of life and happiness, communion, fellowship. So there's something awful about the way in which it becomes the very opposite of that, a source of degradation. And I think the influence of Satan maybe is worth thinking about, because there's a great line from the movie The Exorcist, and it's the one it's actually only in the director's cut. So why they didn't include it in the original is beyond me. But if you've ever seen that movie, it's not for the faint of heart if you've never seen it, so think twice about watching it. But the priests who are doing the exorcism take a break, and they're sitting at the top of the stairs. The little girl's inside, and but before the final scene, they're taking a break and having a conversation. And the one priest says to the other, "Why is this happening? Why is the devil doing this?" And the older, wiser, holier priest says, "I think the point is to make us think of ourselves as animal and ugly, for us to reject the possibility that God could love us." And I think that when the thrill of humiliation, the thrill of humiliating another person, especially in a sexual context, always backfires because sexuality itself becomes degraded. And that ultimately is a source of, that's a terrible offense against human dignity. And we think, how could something we have so closely in common with the animals not be humiliating? Most bodily functions we want to keep hidden. That's John Paul II has this wonderful description of shame, and shame is ultimately a good thing whereby we protect our dignity. But in the case of sexuality, it's supposed to be a source of rejoicing, new life, fellowship, communion. But again, in these depraved contexts, it becomes the very opposite. just as you were saying with the wine, it becomes a source of, the drunkenness of Noah. You sort of get the feeling like perhaps Ham saw his father drunk and thought, here's my chance. He's vulnerable, he's weak, he's barely conscious. I can, and he sort of takes that as an opportunity to accomplish this malicious goal.
So why does Michelangelo depict them as all naked?
That's interesting. Yeah.
I just figured it was because he doesn't put clothes on anymore.
I mean, I knew that was kind of a thing with him, but
I don't think anyone else.
I can like, oh, Dad's naked. We better get naked.
Well, this guy has clothes. This guy has clothes.
Yeah. So it's just very strange to me. You give us a chance to discuss themes that Father David would really never ever.
All right. Well, there you go. Welcome to the new Schola Christi. Yeah. Well, yeah. Maybe it's just sort of a convention of Renaissance art, but it does call to mind that that's this. I mean, I guess you could say that the seeing the Father's nakedness is clearly. It only makes sense in a figurative way here.
They're all like
they're all naked.
Notice that, like, oh yeah, by the way, you're also naked.
Yeah, you're right. They're the one who would say, yeah. So,
Oh well.
that's a good point.
Well, maybe because he have just had sex and get naked anyway. He's trying to get.
But I think what Jim's point is that they're all in that.
He's kind of almost convinced, and then decided to pull back and not do it.
Yeah, perhaps. Okay. Oh, I see what you're saying. They've taken the initial step. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Why don't we close and let us pray together the prayer to Saint Philip Neri. Look down from heaven, Holy Father, from the loftiness of that mountain to the lowliness of this valley, from that harbor of quietness and tranquility to this calamitous sea. And now that the darkness of this world hinders no more those kindly eyes of thine from looking clearly into all things, look down and visit, O most diligent keeper, this vineyard which thy right hand planted with so much labor, anxiety, and peril. To thee then we fly, from thee we seek for aid, to thee we give our whole selves unreservedly. Thee we adopt as our patron and defender. Undertake the cause of our salvation. Protect thy clients. To thee we appeal as our leader. Rule thine army fighting against the assaults of the devil. To thee, kindest of pilots, we give up the rudder of our lives. Steer this little ship of thine, and placed as thou art on high, keep us off the rocks of evil desires, that with thee for our pilot and guide, we may safely come to the port of eternal bliss. Amen. The Lord be with you. And with your spirit. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Go forth.
Thanks be to God.
You're welcome.